Welcome to the 14th consecutive year of the Town History Series, co-sponsored by the Library and Bath Historical Society, and also, in a sense, sponsored by all the historical societies of the towns that support the library. So I would urge you, in fact, I have a couple I haven't signed up to yet, please join all your historical societies and a couple of others outside of your town. The historical societies all need the resources. So join up. This year's series I'm dedicating to two recently deceased important volunteers at the History Room, Mel Hodgkins and Francis Chi-Chi Kakos, who were longtime volunteers and also both very active in Bath Historical Society. Chi-Chi from the very beginning back in 1989. Mel was a trustee on the Historical Society, and they both, so I don't know how many years, together or separately, they served as volunteers in the History Room. They were excellent volunteers. Chi-Chi had all kinds of little tidbits of genealogy and local history, and Mel was very personable, greeting patrons as they came in. He was also very good at researching topics on the microfilm machine. They both were very important volunteers and are already and will continue to be missed. Joe reminds me to talk about Chi-Chi's having run a nursery school called Happy House. And Joe has that because he's a graduate of that nursery school.
No, I have it because it's going to go to the society.
Good, yeah. And this year, as for the last, I don't know how many years, but many, we are financially sponsored by Raymond James, the division in Portsmouth called White Mountains Wealth Management. And we are being filmed for local TV as well as putting on DVDs that can be checked out at the History Room if you have a library card. Today's talk by the current president of Bath Historical Society, Nathan Lipfert, is on some rare shipbuilding tools found in the North End. Nathan.
Thank you very much. I guess I should say at the beginning, I worked at Maine Maritime Museum from 1971 until 2017. So the tools that I'm going to be talking about are all at the museum now, and the pictures that you will see are all from things at the Maritime Museum. So I'm going to be talking about some things that were found on Trufant Street. But first of all, I want to take a quick look at the big picture. These things we find here in Bath that pertain to the shipbuilding industry have more than local interest. Maine was the most productive shipbuilding state in the Union in terms of building vessels for salt water. And we know this because the federal government was very good at keeping statistics of this sort of thing by documenting all vessels. All vessels built for salt water had to be registered or enrolled or licensed in their local customs district. The entire coast of the country was divided up into customs districts by the federal government. And Maine had as many as 14 of these small districts at one time. Some of them are quite large. There's up here in Washington County, quite a spread there. And Waldoboro's nothing to sneeze at. Everything from Bristol to Thomaston is part of the Waldoboro Customs District. And Bath was a district. And the District of Bath included all the towns up and down the river and Topsham, Brunswick, and Harpswell. So all the vessels built at those towns had to be registered at the customs house here, or in the customs office, which was here in Bath. Bath, the customs district of Bath, was the most productive shipbuilding district in Maine, the most productive shipbuilding state. And within the Bath district, the city of Bath itself built more ships than all the others combined, all the other towns in the district combined. So more than 2,500 vessels now have been built here in Bath. So it's not, this industry has national significance and really international significance because the vessels that were built here, for example, the vessels trading to other countries, which had to be registered at the customs house. There, at one point, a quarter of the American vessels that were registered for foreign trade were built in Maine. So, a very significant thing. The shipyards in Bath itself tended to be in either the north end or the south end. There wasn't much, if anything, in the way of shipyards right in the downtown area where the bridge goes across now. But this little section of town from Pearl Street here up to Drummond Street, I don't know what that is, a half mile or so of shore, that was at one point solid shipyards, and shipyards that built literally hundreds of vessels. I have heard somebody say that that section of riverbank built more vessels than any similar sized stretch of shoreline in the world. It's just hundreds and hundreds of vessels being cranked out there. A lot of the yards in that area of town were contract yards, building on contract for people other than the shipyard owner. And in many cases, people from away. Maine had a reputation for building, we'll say, cost-effective vessels. So, Trufant Street. In 2015, a local man named Ben Burden was rebuilding, restoring, refurbishing this house for resale at 31 Trufant Street. And he found some things. They were things that you may have been in this situation too. He thought they were something, but he didn't know what they were. So he sent these snapshots of the objects to his father, Dr. Charles E. Burden, and he wondered if they were something maritime-y at all. And Charlie Burden thought that they were. In fact, he knew that they were. And he recommended that his son contact us. In fact, I think Charlie, you forwarded me the email, I think. And so I got back to Ben and said, yes, please. I wasn't 100% sure what they were either. They're covered with writing. I knew that we'd be able to figure it out when they came. I love this picture. It turns out I have no control over the expression on my face anymore at all. That is a look of appreciation, affection, who knows what. Anyway, when I did get to see them, I didn't know what they were. I had never knowingly seen or touched anything like this before, despite having worked in the museum for more than 40 years in a maritime museum. But I had read about them, and I knew what they were. They're 3 poles, the longest of which was 25 feet long. So that's what this was. There were 2 of them that were found in the attic of that house and 1 in the basement in slightly worse condition. And they bear on them enough marks for us to figure out exactly what they are and what their significance is. The mark here, KS Co. 196, because of the location of the house, the KS Co. must mean Kelly Spear Company, which was a shipyard, I guess where the sewage treatment plant is right now. So immediately to the eastward of the house on Trufant Street. 196 is a hull number. And Kelly Spear Hull 196 was a schooner barge named Falmouth, built in 1919. So we don't actually, surprisingly, we don't have a picture of that vessel, but we do have a picture of an identical vessel built a couple years earlier for the same owners. So it's a coal barge, essentially. There was a vestigial rig. You see these little stumpy masts in her, but rarely, if ever, used. Mostly it would be operated under tow. So, but still a large wooden vessel, over 200 feet. So on the 4 sides, these things are roughly square, and so there's 4 sides, and each side is used and marked with references to parts of a vessel's frame. The big one, the one for hull 196 is the longest. It's 25 feet long, and it's got on the 4 sides of it marks for the 1st futtock, the 3rd futtock, the 5th futtock, those are all parts of a frame, and the gunwale. Now the other 2 poles they don't say that they're for Kelly Spear, but they really can't be for anything else. Hulls 201 and 202, there's no other yard there, probably no other yard in town except Bath Iron Works that's built more than 200 vessels. So we know that those poles are for this pair of vessels. Hull 201 and 202 are, again, schooner barges, the Windsor and the Hutchinson, over 200 feet, built in 1923, and are, in fact, the last large wooden vessels built at Bath. The Kelly Spear Yard closed immediately after they were finished. And they also are covered with marks on each side that explain how to horn different parts of a frame. So I will try to explain how that works. They also are covered with individual marks for a frame. There are each one of these lines has a number written on it, which is the number of a frame. There's also some marks that I have to admit I don't understand at all at this point, why some things would be horned or measured from different points. It may have to do with the altering of a vessel's design. The reason that I knew what these were was because I had read this book about Percy and Small, which is the shipyard that the museum preserves today. And specifically, I had read this appendix called Models, Molds, Layers and Covers, Horning Out and Rising Rods, a primer on the arcane world of traditional wooden ship design as practiced by Percy and Small. And this very detailed and very interesting appendix was written by Captain Doug Lee. And John, was he in your class?
2 years younger than I.
2 years younger than you, okay. So he's 60, class of 66 maybe, or?
65.
65, yeah. So he's grew up in West Bath, attended Morse, and built his own schooner using horning poles similar to these. And we'll go talk about him a bit later. The process of ship design for wooden sailing vessels, large wooden sailing vessels, generally did not involve plans on paper at all. The design of a big wooden hull starts with the half model. And this model embodies the information that is going to be needed to make the frame of the ship. From the model, a loftsman or a draftsman takes measurements and then draws the lines of the vessel full size, scaled up to full size, on the floor of a mold loft. And from those lines, he makes molds or patterns for every piece of every frame in the vessel. This is the only big grouping of molds that we have at the Maritime Museum. It's from a shipyard in Thomaston, Dunn and Elliott, but about the same time period as the horning poles, late teens and 20s. So this huge pile, or several piles here, is probably most of the molds that were needed for a large vessel. Hundreds of them. So each mold is for one piece of wood, piece of timber, that's going to be part of the frame. And when I say a frame, I'm talking about what most people would call a rib of a big wooden ship. The old boys called them frames, so we try to. Each one is marked with the hull number and the frame number and the piece number that it represents. And in order to assemble this frame, you have to understand the process of horning. There are, or at least in order to assemble a frame by this method, there is another method for doing this. But this is the way that the big yards were assembling the frames of large vessels. Horning simply means to measure something from a center line. And so the horning pole is used when you're assembling a big frame on a stage or a platform. It's called the framing stage. So the frame itself ultimately will be rather U-shaped, or it might be towards the ends of the vessel, might be more V-shaped. But it still has to be assembled from quite a few individual pieces. So you establish a center line here, and the horning pole allows you to measure from a specific point on the center line to the upper outside corner of each futtock or each timber in the hull, in the frame. So that's how you know that you're assembling this whole thing to give the shape that it's supposed to have in that particular point on the hull. These frames are what we call today double sawn frames. So you have two layers essentially for each frame, so that anytime there's a joint or a butt between two pieces of timber, it's overlapped by a solid timber in the other half of the frame. The terminology may be different in different areas, different yards, but Doug Lee called this, the bottom layer, the layer, and the upper piece he called the cover. And the way things were usually done, the pieces that the futtocks, which are these curved pieces of the frame here, the first futtock, third futtock, and sometimes a fifth futtock, the odd numbered futtocks were in the layer, and the even numbered futtocks were in the cover. One of the volunteers at the museum was so excited about this information, he made a model to show how it all worked. Makes it a little bit easier to see. You know, you have this mark on the pole, and it lines up with that joint on this frame, this futtock. And so this appendix of the book on Percy and Small includes information on how to use the horning poles and other devices called rising rods and other systems to change the design of a vessel as you're building it, so that even after you have all your half model is done and your molds are done, you can, by playing a few tricks, you can lengthen the vessel, you can broaden the vessel, you can deepen the vessel if you know how to use these tools properly. And this information is really not well recorded anywhere. There were a lot of books on wooden shipbuilding published in a few books published in this country on wooden shipbuilding in the 19th century. Quite a few books published right around the time of the First World War, when there was a big shipbuilding boom. Of course, all the books came out in 1919, 1920, right after the war was over. But they don't have information about this system of setting up frames. Mr. Desmond's book doesn't mention horning poles or horning battens. Mr. Estep's book doesn't mention it. Mr. Webster's book, which is a huge volume, does not mention horning. This fellow, Curtis, Elements of Wood Ship Construction, he does have a couple of pages that explain how to do this, but he does not. His book, for some reason, wasn't as popular as the others. Doesn't have as good pictures, I guess, and so it hasn't been reprinted for model builders or anything else. But he does explain about horning battens and how there are four sides, and you use all four sides to mark the diagonals for different different pieces of the frame. So Doug didn't get the information from books. He learned about these devices by talking to the old boys, the few shipbuilders who were still around in the 1970s and 80s who had built large wooden vessels. Guys like Jim Stevens here, who's a shipbuilder from East Boothbay. So we really have to thank Doug for this information. This was crucial in understanding what these devices were that were found on Trufant Street. If he hadn't written that appendix of that book and I hadn't read it, we still wouldn't know what the darn things were. And Doug used that information himself. He and his wife Linda, Captain Linda, also built their own schooner in 1983 in Rockland using horning poles and all the other devices. Since I've seen these things, I have found some others that in fact were in the museum collection earlier and were unidentified from the Dunn and Elliott yard. And that helped me to, but by seeing how it was done in different yards, it helped in the understanding of what all the marks were and what was going on. I think the way Doug described it in the book, he was talking as if you needed a different horning pole with marks for each frame, which would be a lot of work, especially if you were trying to find 70 or 80 or 90 poles that were 25 feet long to do all this. So, in examining these historical examples of the horning poles, I discovered that they cover almost half the vessel. You would need, because they only have 4 sides, you can only do 4 points on each frame, and the frames have a lot more pieces than that. So you need one pole for the points that are going to be on the layer, the lower piece, and you need another pole for the points on the cover, the second layer. And those marks, as you go from the bow of the vessel towards the widest part of the vessel, those marks are going to be getting closer and closer together, because the center part of the vessel, there's very little change from frame to frame. But then once you've gotten to the widest part, if you started to go back in where the vessel got narrower again, your marks on your pole would start to get confused. They'd be all mixed up. So what seems to be the case is that you have one pole for the bow of the vessel and you have another pole for the stern of the vessel. And in fact, you have 2 poles for the bow, one for the layer, one for the cover, and then for the stern, the layer and the cover also. So in theory, you should be able to build a vessel with 4 of these poles. And once you know about them, you start seeing them in old pictures. This is a Rockland yard, Cobb Butler, 1917, and there's a frame. The layer of a frame is set up on the stage over here, and there's a little spindly stick you see there. That's a horning pole. And here's Percy and Small in Bath, 1916. And they're standing on the framing stage, starting to set up the layer of a 4-mast schooner, and they've got, lo and behold, 2 horning poles right there, one for the layer, one for the cover. Oh, and this is my favorite part. It turns out the museum has a lot of pictures of the Kelly Spear shipyard. Not a big surprise. It was the last wooden shipyard in operation in Bath. And so, but I was pretty excited to realize we have pictures of hulls 201 and 202 that are covered by those horning poles under construction. And so here's one of them with 201 over here and 202 right here. And it's taken on December 16th, 1922, right at the end of operation of that yard. And the photographer has said what frame it is, frame 44. What a nice thing. That's Herbie Douglas. I don't know how many of you knew Herbie Douglas. He had a shop on Broad Street, I think, when I was in high school. And he took official photographs for the Navy, record photographs for naval production at BIW and other yards in the Mid-Coast. So thank you, Herbie, for paying attention and marking these. Now see, here's another picture of the same two hulls taken from a little bit further away the same day. And if you close in on hull 201, that's the framing stage in the foreground. So there's a frame, so frame 44 is already up. Frame 43 probably, because they're working from the stern forward, is under construction on that platform. It's a little hard to pick things out, but you can see a delicate little stick laying across the frame here, and then another one on this side in front of these guys that are working on the stage. So here's one of our horning poles. Unfortunately, the one that was in the basement, it's a little more weathered, but you see the points: 54, 53, 52, 51, 50, 49, 42. So that's right in the middle of the vessel. There's so little change from frame to frame that they haven't bothered to put all the marks in there, but frame 44 is in there. So we have not only this rare example of a shipbuilding device, we have a photograph of that very item being used. You gotta love living in this town. It's so interesting. And the museum's collection, it's just to have these two things, it's so cool. So here's a insurance map of around 1909, a little before the period of the poles. It shows that part of town. So here's Washington Street coming up here, and this is Bowery Street coming up to meet it. And then the roadway that goes down to the North End launching facility now goes into the Kelly Spear shipyard. So that's all right here. This building, I think this building is the one that's still there today. I think it's the last. I know that's from Kelly Spear, but the Kelly Spear yard had a big fire in 1918. It's possible that that's a replacement building. And then to the north of it a bit is the old William Rogers yard, which Kelly Spear ultimately took over and was using. So then Washington Street takes a little bend off to the westward here. Drummond Street is straight down, and Trufant is parallel to it. This is the house where the horning poles were found. And, this, by the way, is where Band Hansen lived, the guy who designed Wyoming, the Sixth Master. So, a very interesting neighborhood. These are the people that were living there in 1922, and this is from the city directory, the 22 directory. So that's the people that were living there when those horning poles were being used. And the person at 31 was a guy named Irving Varney, who was a ship carpenter at the Kelly Spear and Company yard. So we assume, we don't know anything really, but we assume that Mr. Varney at some point brought these home and put them in his attic. I don't know why, anyone would keep these. Without a pile of 300 patterns, you can't use these. There's no, I just can't imagine. And maybe he thought he could cut them up for kindling. That would be nice. I'm sure that's what has happened to every other horning pole in existence. But in any case, well, I had a classmate at Morse named Gary Varney, who I think is here. He says he's not related to this guy, so it's, I haven't learned haven't learned much about the Varney family. I did follow them in the city directory, and there was a Varney living in this house into the, what was it, into the 1970s. So that's, you know, when a family continues living in a house for more than one generation, that's when things accumulate in the house. I know that's what it was in my family. So anyway, you can see how many of these other folks worked at shipyards in the neighborhood. In fact, 73% of the people on the street were directly related in some way to the shipbuilding industry. And this was even at a time when one of these local yards, the Texas Company Yard, had, I think, technically closed. All these people that said they were employed at Texas Company Yard were either actually out of work already or were about to be out of work. In any case, 20 years earlier, it's pretty much the same story. A lot of different names on the street, but still more than 70% of them related to the shipbuilding business. It's remarkable what was going on in the town, in that area. So last year when I went down to take this picture, I was thinking more about Trufant Street, and it occurred to me that I thought there had been another donation to the museum from Trufant Street. And I looked it up, and lo and behold, it was in fact from this house next door in 35 Trufant Street. In 1988, a lady named Margaret Gaith, I think that's how it's pronounced, had, I believe, recently moved into the house and had found these things in a shed and brought them to the museum. She didn't know quite what they were, but she thought they were probably interesting, and she was right. I have no contact with her anymore. They don't live there anymore. I don't know who does. The tools, there are four tools, or pieces of tools really. This black and white pole is 6 feet long. That's just a measuring stick. So you can see the size of these things. They are part of a sawyer's kit of pit saws. This is a device from before the introduction of powered saws of different kinds. That was a common shipyard activity, was making little ones out of big ones by sawing logs or chunks of timber into planks or into pieces of a frame. And it was done, as you see here, there was a tiller man who steered and stood up top and was the boss, and a boxman or a pitman who stood underneath and pushed the saw up and pulled the saw down and picked the sawdust out of his underwear later. So these things, these blades, are for different types of pit saws. The larger one is 7 feet long, big teeth, 3/4 inches apart, and the narrow blade is a little bit less than 4.5 feet and slightly smaller teeth. So the big blade is a standard pit saw blade that is is made so that there's an easily detachable handle at the top called a tiller, and an even more easily detachable handle at the bottom called a box. Because every time you needed to shift your timber, which was fairly frequently, you needed to pull that saw out of the kerf, and so you had to remove one of the handles. These kind of big wide blades tracked very nicely, so you could make long straight cuts fairly easily with these things. The narrow blade is something in the United States is called a whip saw, and it's generally somewhat smaller, and because it's a narrower blade, it's steerable. So you could make a curved cut with this. You can make an angled or beveled cut more easily with these guys. So this is something you would find very frequently in a shipyard where you were trying to make a curved piece of a frame. You could saw it with a whip saw. Also part of the gift was this pit saw handle, the tiller. It strangely does not fit either of the blades that came with it. It's just like an extra quarter of an inch or so that if you could jam that thing on more, it would work properly. But you can see how this rectangular bolt in the middle, which does fit the holes in the blades, it would come through, and then you have this wedge that goes through it, so you can hold the thing on the blade. And this is what it looks like. This is another example of a similar saw at the museum. And then the box, the handle at the bottom, this is another example from somewhere else in the museum's collection that happens to fit both the wide blade and the narrow blade. And the cant hook. This is a device that is pretty commonly used in a number of different trades. Anybody that has to move big timbers around, and that's what sawyers had to do in order to get the timber over your pit and set up on the props. You had to roll it with a cant hook. This illustration, there's some things that are kind of English about this illustration, but it does show you the different types of pits. You could have a pit that was sort of a trench, basically dug in the ground and lined with stone or with boards. Or you could have a pit that was cut into a bank, like a bulkheaded bank, and then a wall built beside it. Or you could have a pit frame that was just essentially a giant sawhorse kind of arrangement. And surely all three types were used around here. I have only found one photograph, and believe me, I have looked at thousands of photographs of shipyards. I've only found one Bath shipyard anyway that showed a saw pit, and that's in the left foreground of this picture from 1890, which is it looks like it's the type of pit that's cut into a bank with a bulkhead, and then in this case, a wooden wall built beside it, set up on pilings of some sort. And the reason that you don't see them in photographs is that by the time cameras were common, this system of hand sawing stuff had been replaced largely by powered saws. By the early 1880s, most shipyards in Bath had a steam-powered jigsaw like this for cutting all sorts of timbers, and it has this circular frame and a reciprocating blade jumps up and down, and you could, using the cranks, you could move the blade so it would cut different angles. And an ordinary bandsaw was pretty common in shipyards from the 1870s. And this is a not quite ordinary bandsaw. This is a ship saw we're currently in use at the museum, but it was previously used at a shipyard in East Boothbay, that is similar to the jigsaw in that you can change the angle that you're cutting at. And a skilled operator, one of these, well, you can see the angle in this small timber that the guy's cutting in the picture. The frame of a ship, the side of a vessel is not just a curve, it's a compound curve. It's curving in two directions at once. And so the bevel or angle you're sawing on a frame timber up top is going to be different from the angle lower down on the frame. So a skilled operator could change that bevel as you're moving the timber through the saw, cutting a curve in the flat dimension. You're also changing your bevel as that thing goes through the blade, which has nothing to do with pit saws, but it makes you appreciate why these things were given up so early. And so I think that these things date to the 1870s or earlier. The guy in the house at that time and through most of the second half of the 19th century was an Irishman actually named Alexander Mulligan, and his family stayed in that house also for at least into the 60s. So he, in most places in the city directories and in the census, he was referred to as a ship carpenter. But in one early directory from 1871, he refers to himself as a sawyer. So I think these are his tools, and I think they're from that period, 1870s or earlier. And so this is a rare thing. We knew what these were. There's lots of books that have pictures of them, but to have a set of things like this that came from one guy, one identifiable person, is pretty highly unusual. So, this is the way things are around here. Interesting bits of shipbuilding history are going to turn up in any house around here. Certainly any house that's like older than us. And not just in Bath, any house in the county, really. So if you find something and you think it might be something, but you don't know what it is, please bring it to Maine Maritime Museum. There's a very nice curator there now who's taken my place, named Ann Whitty, and she's worked for a lot of different maritime museums. She's lived in this area for quite a while, and she knows her stuff, and she'll solve your mystery. Thank you.